So welcome everyone to this Tuesday's VDEV CEPR BREAD seminar. And this Tuesday, we're very happy to have Rachel Glennerster from the University of Chicago to join us and talk about the media or the message, experimental evidence on mass media and contraceptives in Burkina Faso. The seminar is organized as we normally do it. So Rachel will be presenting for 45 minutes with a few interruptions with questions, if there are some clarification questions. You write the questions in the Q&A during the talk, and then during the last 15 minutes, then Rachel will also answer questions live. So the last 15 minutes, you raise your hand and questions will be asked by you and answered by Rachel live. Yes, we're ready to go. We're very happy to have you here, Rachel.
Thank you very much. Let me just... Sorry, that's bars. Sorry.
That's fine.
Okay, thank you, everyone. This paper is joint with Joanna Murray from Development Media International and Victor Pouliquin, who is on hand to help answer questions and is on the job market this year. So you should look out for him if you're looking for a great development economist. So the paper is about both what's the impact of introducing mass media in a community and to people who don't have very much access to mass media. So it's a unique opportunity to look at the impact of, the first time basically people get access to mass media, and also at a mass media campaign. So we're going to focus on the impact on fertility. And this is a paper about West Africa and Burkina Faso in particular. And as you can see from this visual, in a lot of countries, fertility has reduced a lot, but in West Africa and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa, we still have quite high rates of fertility. And it's not just that people want fewer children, there's a big unmet need for contraception. What we mean by unmet need is that people express that they don't want to have a child, and yet they're not using contraception. So it's not that they can't access contraception. It's in many of these places, contraception is available. It's just that they're both expressing that they don't want to have more children, and yet they're not using contraception. So again, we see a lot of this in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and it's high in our context in Burkina Faso. We're going to ask the question of whether mass media can be a solution to this. And there's been quite a lot of research in the past looking at the relationship between mass media and contraception. And found that being linked to mass media can be associated with lower fertility and more liberal views, by which we mean more accepting of contraception and accepting of a woman's ability to control her fertility. So what are the possible channels for this? Well, mass media might provide you information about how to get access to contraception. It might change your salience in particular. It might, you might be aware that other people are using it. You might be aware, and this is one of the mechanisms that people have found in the past, is, if you see a lot of families with small numbers of children on mass media, in sitcoms in Brazil, they found this, then you see that kind of a modern family might be small, and that might increase your desire to have fewer children. So align your preferences with the wider community norms. But it's also the case that mass media has been associated with spreading illiberal views. So we saw, that access to the radio was used as a mechanism for genocide in Rwanda, and the rollout of Fox News has been associated with people becoming more conservative in their views. So we're going to ask, can mass media campaigns be effective in changing family planning behaviors? And we've seen in previous literature that targeted health messages can change people's behavior, even on things that are quite important and personal. And, for example, on HIV, attitudes and prevention. But a lot of this work on, kind of targeted health messages has been done not at all how we normally consume mass media. So it's been, very directed. You sit people down, or you bring them into a studio and watch something. And we're really interested in seeing the impact of mass media the way it's normally consumed. So, with the radio playing in the background and lots of other things coming across. So it's quite hard to do this kind of at scale, real world conditions of mass media, because it is mass, right? You've got to broadcast it to lots of people. So what we're going to do here is look at community radio in Burkina Faso. And this is, a context where most people are getting their media from the radio. And community radios in particular in Burkina Faso are important because they are they're in the local language, and most people don't speak French, which is the language of the national radio. And we're going to do a 2-level RCT. We're going to randomize at the individual level, handing out radios. So there's still a lot of people in these communities who are too poor to own a radio. And so we can, change their access, give them access to mass media by giving them a radio. And so we hand out 1,500 radios to women with no radios. And then we can, and then the second level of randomization is at the radio station level. So we're going to randomize some radio stations to play the mass media campaign on family planning. And we're talking about 8 radio stations out of 16 are randomized to get the mass media. And that's, 25% of the population of Burkina Faso is involved. So it's quite and it's a 2.5-year program. So it's going to be quite an intensive program that we're looking at. So just to give you a preview of results, we find that receiving a radio in status quo areas, in other words, places that aren't getting the campaign, decreased contraceptive prevalence by 18%. So a big effect and a reduction, and really contrary to everything that we've seen in previous research about mass media increasing people's use of contraception. Now, I want to stress this is not because these community radios had, an agenda and, illiberal anti-contraception agenda. All of them were willing to take part in this study. All of them were happy to run this campaign, but they did provide a platform for local views. They are community radios. They reflect back the community, and these communities are relatively conservative in the sense that most people in them are not using contraception. So it's very consistent, we think, with people falling more into line with the norms in their community when they're more linked to their community through mass media. Now, where in the communities that were exposed to this targeted mass media campaign about family planning run by Development Media International, we see a 20% increase in contraception use. And we have a couple of different identification strategies to get at this. We get very similar results from the different approaches. And the mechanism we find a lot of evidence for is that this campaign reduced misinformation. So around the world, you will feel, you will hear women are concerned about using contraception because it might make them sterile. And the number of women who believe that goes down substantially after the campaign. And we even see a reduction in births in response to this increase in contraception. And because mass media is, you can do one program and you can get many, many people, it proves to be highly cost effective. So I'm going to give you a little bit more detail on the context and about the campaign, and then dig into the data and results. So we're doing this in Burkina Faso, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, with very poor health and education outcomes and a very high fertility rate of 6 births per woman. And only 22% of women are using contraception, and 23% of women have unmet need. This is the definition of where you want to not have more children and but are not using contraception. And Burkina Faso has made quite an effective effort to make sure that supply is available. So they've made a lot of progress in supply, and we're going to work in areas where people can access contraception if they want to. Let me see if I can turn that off. Right. So you can see so we're going to be working with these community radio stations, and here's a map of how they're spread across the country. And we're working with 16 community radio stations covering 15 million people. And what do these radio stations do? Well, during peak listening time, they're doing information shows, debates and call-ins, they're playing music, they are taking some content from the national radio, and there's some coverage of behavior change programs. This is where, NGOs or government that are trying to do campaigns will ask them to put things on the radio, and there's a little bit of religious shows. And in some careful work, which I have to thank Victor for doing, going through, looking in detail, we were able to classify that it looks like men are speaking about 80% of the time on these radio stations. Now, what is the campaign doing? Well, it follows this plan that that Development Media International, who's a very experienced media developer, have designed, and one of their key tenets is saturation. So they believe that it's really important to get the message, for people to hear it many times. And this is, something that media people think is very important. So in this case, it's 2.5 years of broadcasting, 10 radio spots a day, and then 2 intensive programs a week where they really kind of dig into people's questions. And they're covering 17% of peak listening time. So it's really working through the salience. You're constantly hearing about family planning. This is an organization that bases their work very much on the science. They have epidemiologists on staff, including Joanna, who worked with us on this study. And when they mean by science is they pull things from behavioral economics and psychology about what influences people's behavior, but also that they go to the communities and spend time in the communities and understand what are the knowledge gaps locally so that they can fill those. And so the programs are designed to specifically fill the gaps in understanding that people have. And they also use these psychological issues, knowledge about how we as humans think and change our views on things. So they have stories and humor, and they're trying to, do edutainment as part of how these messages are got over. Now, as I said, we're doing a 2-level randomization. And so first of all, we take these different radio stations and randomize 8 to get this intensive media campaign. And then within each area, we do an individual level randomization of 1,500 women receiving a radio and another 5,500 that we're tracking that don't. These are amongst women that we find at baseline don't have a radio, or they don't have a radio in their household. So we're really introducing radio to these communities. And as I said, the radio campaign goes on for 2.5 years. The radio distribution happens partway into the campaign. We had to go off and raise money to get the radios. So the results I'm going to show you on that is a little bit shorter than 2.5 years. And then we're going to get data from the government on how many contraceptives were delivered to the clinics in these different areas. We have a much longer time horizon for that, and we're getting monthly data, and we can look at it, a lot of pre-trends. So we've got a lot of different sources of data here. We have our survey of women in 252 villages that were chosen from these communities, but we're deliberately targeting our survey to places where you can hear the radio, so it's within 50 kilometers of the radio station. We don't want people to be listening to television. We wanted to look at kind of really intensely if people are listening to the radio. So we're not going to villages with electricity where people might have television, and we're looking at smaller villages rather than the towns, and also within a close enough distance to a clinic that people could actually get contraception if they wanted to. But this, we are putting quite a lot of conditions on this, but this is nevertheless representative of about 10% of the population of Burkina Faso. Now, you may have heard Burkina Faso is deteriorated into a lot of conflict, and there were parts of our communities we couldn't go to for security reasons. So we collect data in the end line by phone from those communities, but we still have quite good take-up rates for that. We do go back to the clinics and survey the clinics and ask them about how many people are coming in for contraceptive consultations or family planning consultations. And then, as I've said, we have monthly data on the distribution of contraception. And this is a much more representative sample because, it's not just the villages that were in 5 kilometers of a clinic, etc. It's really a much broader area. And then we've got radio content. So we've got the program logs of both treatment and control radio stations.
So Rachel, I'm gonna interrupt and ask a few questions.
Yep.
So the first question is by Philippe Cabora, and he's asking, do we know whether the treated group listen to local radio in presence of their partner or whether you're watching TV alone?
So you're not watching TV because none of these people have TV, but are you listening? Yeah, you're listening with a partner. So we give the radios to women normally. And we'll interview a lot of people who we haven't given radios to. They've just had a radio at baseline. So those people, they might be, the radios may often be owned by men. They may listen on their own, if sometimes they take them to the fields, or they may listen at home with various other people around. So we don't have a huge amount of data on, exactly who's listening, but we're assuming that several people in the family are listening. And indeed, the radio programming is very much focused on men too. Like DMI were not thinking they were just talking to women, they're deliberately targeting men too. So you should think of this as everyone in the community hearing these messages in men and women.
Thank you. And the second question is by David Margolis, and he's asking, do most households have multiple stations, radio station? And do you know if people switch stations when you get kind of bored of the same thing? So when you get repeated things, might they switch station?
Yeah. So the reason why Burkina Faso is quite a useful place to do this is because you don't have a ton of choice in your radio, because the government kind of prescribed that radio stations can only project their radio content in a relatively restricted area. And so you don't have and we picked the radio stations that aren't overlapping a lot. So you can hear the national radio, but the national radio is in French, and the vast majority of this population have very poor French. A lot of them haven't been to school at all, so they don't really, there's very little listening to the national radio station. So you might be able to get 2 radio stations, but we picked areas where this is really the dominant radio station. And we collect data on the listenership, and we don't actually find that having the campaign changes very much how much you listen. We do see when you give someone a radio, they listen more, obviously.
Okay, and then a couple of more questions. So I have a question, and I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more these radio spots. So they're 1.5 minutes, and they're like 10 times per day, but how much knowledge can you spread in 1.5 minutes? And what is this? Because otherwise it was these talk shows, which is more you call in and you discuss and so on. So what are these radio spots?
So the radio spots are, partly about salience. So they're partly about just reminding you, but you can actually get quite a lot in. I'm working with DMI now on doing, some videos, and they're like, you don't want to have these longer than 1.5 minutes because people can't concentrate. So they will, they'll be picking we hear advertisements all the time that are very short. So, think of that. Think of the kinds of messages you hear on the radio, sort of jingles and reminding you about something and reinforcing, some simple messages, that it's important to do birth spacing, that it's important that, contraception is safe. And, remember you have a choice of different kinds of contraception. So you can get a lot of these, you're kind of reinforcing these basic messages that then you have more time to talk about. So the long slots, they often had like a local healthcare provider come in, and people call in and ask, well, are there side effects? So they kind of really dug into the people's concerns in these longer things, and then they just kind of reminded them of the main points in the short slots.
Okay, and then 2 clarifying questions more. One from Punat Arora. So what is peak time here? So what does women do during, or women and men then do during peak time? So what is a peak time? And the other question, I'll just ask that as well by Michael Kivane, is do you have data on the home language spoken versus the program language?
Okay, so the program language is always the dominant local language in that area. We probably do, I think we do have language, there will be some people obviously speaking a different language there, and I can't remember if we find differential effects for people who aren't speaking that particular local language, but I think it's pretty high they're speaking in the local language that's very dominant in the area, and therefore most people living in that area will speak that. And sorry, what was the first one?
And the other question was on the peak hour.
Oh yes, the peak hours. So these women are looking after families, and they are working and they are farming mainly. And so the peak hours are in the morning before they go out, and the evening, I think. But Victor, you probably know that in more detail.
Yes, exactly. You're right. Early in the morning and in the evening, and that's like a large majority according to our baseline data.
Right.
Yes, thank you, Rachel.
Okay, I'll keep going. So this just gives you a little bit of information about the characteristics of people in the study. I'm going to skip over this. Sorry, I seem to be out of I somehow got ahead. Okay, so we're going to look at how this the impact of this program on information about family planning, norms and attitudes, and other outcomes like subjective health, perceptions and gender norms, and women's empowerment. I'm sorry, I need to go back. I've somehow got out of. Okay, here we go. Okay, so at our baseline, we have 23% of women using contraception. A lot of this is implants and injectables, and very little on pills. Implants are introduced by or not normally done by the clinic themselves. They're done by another NGO, so that's gonna be, and the NGO is, isn't always available, so that's going to be a little bit harder thing to shift. But we'll look at in detail, and the government doesn't have as much data on implants. So when we come to looking at the contraception use, we'll mainly be focusing on injectables and pills, but we can rely on our survey for implants. So we're gonna look at this in the analysis is going to be done in 3 different ways. So we're going to compare people who get a radio to those who don't get a radio, both in treatment, both in campaign areas and non-campaign areas. And then we're going to look at the impact of the campaign using our survey data by comparing, how much contraception women are using in areas covered by the campaign and those not. And that's that second one is a relatively small number of clusters, and so we're going to have to use wild bootstrap procedures to address that. And then we're going to look at the administrative data, and here we're doing a difference in difference because we have a long time trend of data, and see if the distribution of contraception changes after we introduce the campaign. Okay. So, but first of all, we need to know whether the radio distribution increased of people's exposure to the radio. enter the campaign. And we find that, handing out a radio doubled the ownership of radios. Obviously, some people who didn't have a radio at baseline went out and bought one, but we still see a very big increase from 33% to 68% of owning a radio in those families where we've given them a radio. And this doubles women's listening time in those communities, in those households. And it increases the amount that people will hear about family planning on the radio, even in non-campaign areas. So the campaign didn't change, as I say, how much people listen to the radio, but it did change a lot in what they listened to. So, about half of the surveyed women have a radio, about 2 hours, is spent listening to the radio a week. And you see a big increase in the reports that they give about listening to behavior change programs. You have an increase in ever hearing about family planning on the radio, but mainly because even in the non-campaign areas, you are hearing something about family planning, but it's really changing the type of family planning messages that you're hearing. So our main outcome is, what is the impact of all of this on contraception use? And I'm going to start by just saying, what is the impact on contraception use among in non-campaign areas? So, in other words, in a non-campaign area, you get a radio, and therefore you listen to general mass media more. What does that do? Well, we see a fall in the amount of contraception use in those groups. And from 33% to 28%, so quite a big percentage point reduction. If we look at the impact of the radio campaign, we can do that in 3 different ways. We can look at the impact of handing out a radio in campaign areas, and handing out a radio in a campaign area actually increases your use of contraception compared to where it reduced your use of contraception if you got a radio in a non-campaign area. We can also just compare all the women in campaign areas to all the women in non-campaign areas. And again, we see a big increase in the use of contraception. And we can then hone in on just the women who had a radio at baseline in campaign areas and non-campaign areas. And again, we see an even bigger increase in the use of contraception, as you would expect if you focus your attention on those people who had a radio at baseline. So it's important to note these are like entirely different sources of independent variation, and they're all giving us the same message, which is that radio campaign had a big increase in use of contraception. We get the same message if we look at clinic data. So they're seeing an increase in the number of family planning patients. They're seeing an increase in the number of injections they use and the number of pills that they're distributing. If we survey the clinics, there's no impact on implants, but as I said, the clinics aren't the ones doing the implants, so that's not very surprising. If we look at the data over time, we see, if we use the linear trend model, we're seeing very similar trends before the introduction of the campaign in campaign and non-campaign areas. And then we see a divergence. So almost immediately, actually, people are using more contraception. The government is having to distribute more contraception, more oral pills, and more injectables after the introduction of the campaign. Now, why do we get these results? Well, in particular, I think probably the most puzzling is, why do we see that mass media reduce contraception in status quo areas? So where there isn't a campaign going on, because this is completely at odds to what else has been found in the literature. So we're going to look at this information, attitudes, and other outcomes. And we see that if you get a radio, even though you're hearing something about family planning on the radio in a non-campaign area, there's no change in your knowledge about family planning, right? So all the messages the government is putting out on the normal radio is not changing your knowledge. Now, we see, we do see, we see no change in women's perceptions of fertility. We do see a decline in husbands' perceptions of fertility, and also a decline in gender attitudes. So just being exposed to general mass media in this context is, exposing you to some conservative views, and is making women, remember 80% of the talking is done by men, so it can have a worsening impact on gender attitudes. And we see some evidence that this is concentrated, or that what we're seeing is people who wanted to use contraception are then not using it. So, it's making no difference to women who wanted more children at the beginning, but we see a big effect on women who wanted fewer children. They are now less likely to use contraception. So at baseline, they kind of should be using contraception, but when they have reinforced the messages around them through the community radio, they're less likely to use contraception. So now let's turn to why we think the campaign did increase contraception use. Well, first of all, it changed the content of what people are hearing on the radio. And remember, they just take over kind of 17% of peak listening time, and you're hearing stuff from DMI as opposed to what else you were hearing that might be conservative, including these debates and calling shows, which are very cheap for community radios to run, and people just phone in and express the views of the community. And we heard from radio station managers that they felt when people expressed in these call-in shows, in the non-campaign areas, if they expressed anti-contraceptive views, the community people in the radio station, they don't have any way of combating that. They don't know very much about contraception. So when DMI comes in, they not only introduce their information, but they also squeeze out these other formats that might be providing negative contraception messages. And they also increase the share of women talking as a result of their shows having more women.
Rachel, just
yes.
to let you know, you have 10 minutes.
Okay, great. So what we see here is that as a result of their campaign, women in campaign areas have much more knowledge about contraception. So this campaign was very effective in increasing women's knowledge. And their attitudes towards family planning, which I'm going to come back to in a minute, and these seem to be the big drivers of what is happening: more knowledge and improved attitudes towards contraception. And I just point out on the right that you see a big increase in well-being, sort of just self-reported well-being, which is suggestive that women, if they know they have access and can trust something that would help them control their fertility, that just makes them happier. But it's quite a big effect. So let's dig into what's behind those indexes that sort of summarize, that we found in changes in knowledge. Well, in particular, we see this very big fall in people thinking that contraception can make a woman sterile, and that it can cause sickness. So these are the things that are really driving that index on knowledge and on attitudes, because people think that it's less likely to make them sick and less likely to make them sterile. And this is a very, prevalent form of misinformation that you find around the world. So it's, it's very interesting that this media campaign managed to address it. It also changed the who people listen to get information on contraception. So they're much more relying on the radio to get information about contraception. And in response, they're listening less to other members of the community. So they're more likely to go to the radio for information and less likely to go to the community, which involves a lot of conservative people who aren't using contraception. So we think that, it's not just what you get from the media, it changes who you listen to more generally. Now, it's quite interesting who it is when we dig into who is changing their behavior. It's particularly concentrated on women who are using contraception at baseline. Well, you might ask, how on earth can you increase the contraceptive use of people who are using it at baseline? Well, the answer is people aren't using it very consistently. So a lot of people are using it at one point and they're not using it at another point. But we see that, you get much more consistency in the campaign areas. And this, it's also women who want fewer children, who have unmet need. And so the campaign isn't really changing preferences, as we saw in the previous, they're not changing, whether they want, how many, kids they want, etc. They are instead, you should think of this as moving the women who wanted to have fewer children, but weren't using contraception consistently. It's getting them to use it much more consistently. And this is very, consistent with a human capital model where people are, you're likely to move people on the border of wanting to adopt or not. It could also be consistent with people who, kind of want to be using contraception but forget, and the salience is important. It's not consistent with some views of the mass media that it's really about changing preferences, that you get in some, that you're going to have most impact when you change preferences, which comes out of some media models. And I want to sort of push this point again, that we have this very big impact on well-being of people's self-assessed health and well-being measure, which I think we can, potentially attribute to women feeling like they have the ability to control their fertility, and that can, really help, or if they're using contraception, that it's not going to cause all sorts of problems for them. So it's a kind of reassurance. Now, if we look, we weren't really powered to look at number of children. We weren't expecting to be able to pick that up. But if you look at the women who are most likely to change, the kinds of women who are most likely to change, adopt contraception, we see a reduction in the number of births given they had in the last year, suggesting that indeed the increased contraception is leading to fewer births. And we see an increase in the amount of sex they're having, which may also be, if you think of abstinence as one of the methods that people use if they don't trust modern contraception, then that might also be helping increase their well-being. It can be pretty hard to assess welfare in when you're changing people's preferences, but in this case, we're really just empowering people to do the action that they wanted to do by reducing misinformation, which suggests that we can interpret this increase. We can't just say more contraception is good, because it depends on what you want. But in this case, it's people who don't want to have kids realizing it's safe and then using contraception. So I think we can make some welfare claims here. Just in the last 2 minutes, I'm going to just say something about cost effectiveness. We use the data from DMI so we have all the costs of this program, and we know how many people it reached, and how much it reduced contraception, how much it increased contraception use, and we can calculate that it costs them, $47 per additional woman using contraception. Now, that's assuming that our surveys are representative, and remember, they're not representative of all of the communities getting the radio. And so we're just in this estimate assuming that it's only having the effect on women who, of the kind that we see responding in the survey. Now, DMI did scale up this program after the positive effects to reach, really the whole of the country. And then we have data on how much it cost to run the program when it was at scale, and the cost per woman reached goes down. But here we have to make more assumptions about it having the same kinds of impact on the kinds of women which weren't always in our survey. However, I would say that, when we look at the admin data, we actually see bigger impacts on the women who aren't aren't the kind of women in our villages, but more generally, they are actually responding more so we have a lot of basis for, I think, generalizing these impacts to a wider population. So I'm just going to leave it there. We're doubling exposure to local radio stations without a campaign actually reduces contraceptive use, whereas a large intensive behavioral change family planning campaign has a big improvement in contraceptive use. It addresses misinformation and was highly cost effective. And it suggests that, it might be a good idea for these family planning campaigns to attack these marginal adopters, through behavioral models and increase sales. So I am going to stop sharing and come back for questions.
Thank you so much, Rachel. So I'm going to leave the floor to Garance first.
Hi, Rachel. You did not talk about, so at the end, you had some data on frequency of sexual interaction, but you did not talk about it in the context of the radio. And the first thing that comes to mind is they're watching TV or they're listening to radio. There was a minister of health in India who wanted to distribute TV to reduce fertility. So just if people are a little bit more busy doing something else, especially in a context where, you use sometimes contraception, sometimes you forget. If there's less action, maybe you use less. Do you have any evidence that that's the case?
Yeah, so it actually goes the other way. You have more sex.
You have more sex with the radio?
Yes. For the radio in general, if you just, in the campaign areas, you have more sex because you're using more contraception.
Yeah.
But you're saying in the non-campaign areas.
The fact of distributing the radio, my first thought is now they have something to do in the evening.
Victor, do you know? Can you remember that? I can't remember us looking at that. I'm not sure whether we looked at it.
So on that, I don't think we find any effect on that. But the increase in time spent listening to the radio is like 2 hours. So it's not like TV from one day to another, you spend all your time watching TV.
Okay. It would be
nice.
So
I think it's a bit different than TV. I think with TV, you do get these effects. People have found these effects of kind of people to go out and socialize. And I think a radio is a little less kind of absorbing and, which is why it's quite interesting that you can have these effects because it's not,
Okay. But the sign is I don't know, because at the end they are having sex too. No,
Yeah, in the non-campaign areas, I think we just don't find any impact either way.
Thank you.
Okay, and also just reminding the attendees that you are, if you want to ask a question, just raise your hand and I will unmute you. So Rachel, I also, now I'm going to say my question because I get too much airtime otherwise. I'm going to have Michael Kevane has a question. I'm opening up. Yes.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. A very quick question, and possibly one, that the survey doesn't address, but do you know, it seems like a very intensive campaign, and presumably then, local thought leaders, if you want to call them that, are aware of this. So I'm curious whether there was any, sense that imams and pastors, might have been delivering a response messages, presumably they're sort of aware of this. So just curious whether there was any, anecdotal evidence of that.
Well, there is one very dramatic piece of evidence on this, which is, as I say, Burkina Faso was going through, and still is unfortunately going through this conflict with people, jihadists, and I mean, it's not just jihadists, but some of them are jihadists. And other violent groups coming in over the border. And one of the radio stations was threatened and told, we don't like you talking about contraception. You need to shut it down. And so, we randomized 8 stations to get the campaign and only 7 ran it. Now, obviously, we follow the randomization and we include them and do an intent to treat, but one of the radio stations was, was threatened that they would be blown up if they kept talking about contraception. So they stopped. Now, it has now gone nationwide, and I don't think they're having, I haven't heard of another example of that happening again, but yes, it is, people are aware. Now, in terms of, we didn't collect data on, whether this was changing attitudes and activity amongst the, in the religious discussions, but I can, it definitely is a topic of conversation. And I think I would say, though, that DMI is very, they didn't do, as I work with other partners, sometimes they didn't do a deliberate going out to the religious groups beforehand, but they do, but they're very sensitive to, with their local producers of kind of trying to make sure that those messages are well, sound very local and sound appropriate and are not, don't sound like, they're based in London, but it doesn't sound like these are messages coming from London, right? They're all written by Burkina writers, and so they're trying not to set off, all the bad press that you might imagine would come with this.
Thank you, Rachel. So raise your hand if you have more questions. So I have a question, and it's on part is on the effect that you find on the type of contraceptives that they use. So you find larger findings on injectables. So did you or can you study whether this is because women do not want to show that they are using contraceptives? And similarly, did you study the impact on men on these types of questions? I saw one of the variables was perception of men, but in general, what are their views and their information? Do they learn more and so on as well?
Yeah, so unfortunately, we didn't interview men. It would have been great to, it would also, we were very, very worried about power. And so, we didn't want to interview half as many people, but get the men as well. So we can't say a lot about, what we can do is look at the heterogeneous effects by whether men were the decision makers at the beginning. at baseline, and we find that the families where men were the decision makers about contraception at the beginning were particularly badly responded to getting a radio in the non-campaign areas. So that's why we said it kind of seems like that pressure to respond to the community being conservative about contraception is, seems to be particularly strong for men. They seem to be most, subject to that. I'm not saying it's all there, but it's, it's stronger amongst those groups. And we see more of an increase in contraception. Victor, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the campaign areas amongst women who were families where women had a say. So it does seem to mainly be working through the positive effect is stronger amongst those families where women had more of a say in contraception. I'd say, DMI is definitely trying to change men's attitudes, but maybe was somewhat less successful in that than, they were trying to change preferences about numbers of children. So there are various things they were trying to change that they didn't succeed in changing. This kind of misinformation about what the, that it could sterilize you or have bad side effects, I think was the main one. And that's obviously something that women care a lot about. And so that might be why it's working mainly through the families where women had a say in contraception. Now, in terms of the implants, I want to be clear. It's not that we don't find an effect on implants. It's basically an effect across the board. We don't have as much power on implants from the government because the government isn't doing the implants. And we also had something happening, which is Mary Stopes, which is the NGO that goes around and does the implants. They seem to have seen that contraception was going up in our areas, and so they went more to the control areas. So if we ask, was Mary Stopes around here doing implants, is actually higher in the control areas. So it would, that makes it harder to pick up an implant. And we basically see our if you look at each individual one on its own, they're not significant. And if you put them all together, they are in the women's survey. So it's not that we don't see a positive effect. It's just when I showed you the more power we have on the individual is the government's data about how much they were handing out, and they're just not doing the implants. So we're not seeing anything there, but that doesn't mean women aren't getting implants. We do see a positive coefficient on the implant in the women's survey, but we don't have a lot of power to distinguish it from other methods. How much are they hiding it? There's certainly the reasonable proportion of women, even at baseline, say there's nothing wrong in hiding using contraception from your husband. I mean, I was quite surprised by those results. I think it's like a quarter at least, or something in that order of magnitude of women, or even higher, say, it's fine to hide it from. Now, injections, but injections are also more convenient. Like, you have to remember to take a pill every day. So they just are a very common use, common thing. For people, like, it's a very convenient form of contraception.
And then, so I had two questions and I have 1 minute, but I'll still ask it. So one of them is, when I think about, mornings or evenings, as a woman, it's very busy time if you have kids. So having time to listen to radio, or in the richer world, watch TV, is very hard because kids are going to get off to school, they're going to get fed and so on. So I'm thinking, if you have the age of women and if you see that older women listen more, or women with older children listen more compared to younger, or the opposite, and if there's something you can explore given the age of the women and their ability to listen. And then the other question I had was on your result in the non-campaign areas. and the women that you distribute radios to, and the fact that they decrease contraception. So this is not like a hate radio or hate contraceptives, but how should we think about, we think that mass media might be good in many ways when it comes to informing and healthcare and so on. How should we take this?
Yeah, I think the way to think about it is the following. We normally think of mass media as connecting people who are on the edge and kind of more disadvantaged and maybe more conservative to a kind of more modern society, to urban area, to mass media that's coming from urban areas and where fertility is lower. And therefore you're kind of pulling their norm into the norm that of a group that already has lower fertility. Mm. And in this case, that's not the case. What you're making salient is the norms of the community, because it's community radio. It's not linking you with an urban population. It's not that the people in the community are anti. The people who are running the radio station, more educated, probably have lower fertility than other people in the community. But it's just a radio station that is reflecting back the norms of the community. And the norms of the community are that you don't use contraception. Mm. Like, it's just the average person doesn't use contraception in these communities. So if you're kind of out of whack with, if you are the one person who's using contraception and everyone, and it becomes very salient and nobody around you is, maybe you go back to the mean. In terms of your other question, I think we should look at that age. Obviously, age is also associated with whether you want to stop having children, and those are exactly the women that we're influencing.
Or maybe number of kids is what you should explore, maybe something like that.
Yeah.
Florence, we are a little bit out of.
But do they discuss at all, like, because it's one thing about reflecting the message around contraception in the treatment area and the campaign, but the radio, do they discuss?
Yeah, so they have calling shows. Okay. And the radio producers, the people who run those stations, reported in qualitative work that people would call in and say bad things about contraception, and they didn't feel able to say anything because they're not trained on it. Now, obviously, they were hoping to work with DMI, so that might be why they were saying that. But that's their self-report, that yes, people call in and say, will say sort of the typical things that you would hear from men in these communities about contraception and about important to have large families. That is the norm. And you don't have the nurse there saying, well, no, actually, can I explain to you, actually, it's not going to have this negative effect. And that's what DMI is doing. It's, yes, people are still calling in, but then you have somebody there who can respond to it. Somebody from the community, somebody they trust, who says, well, let me explain to you how these things work.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel and Victor as well. It was a great presentation. Thanks a lot. And I think this is the last VDEV before Christmas. Yes, it is. So we'll see you in the next year, and follow us on Twitter, and there you'll find out when the next VDEV is. Thanks, Rachel, for closing the fall semester of the VDEV, CEPR and BREAD seminars.
Great. Thank you very much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, and Merry Christmas to everyone.
Happy holidays.
And happy holidays, yes.